Today we'll be dealing with the land revenue settlements in British India. It should be pointed out at the outset that the establishment of colonial rule by the British bourgeoisie brought about far-reaching changes in Indian society. And one of those was obviously the change in the agrarian structure. The pre-colonial Indian society was a feudal society, and in its place was established was set up a semi-feudal and semi-colonial structure. And the old feudal structure was mostly dismantled. Land now became a commodity, alienable private property. And peasants' traditional right of occupancy to land was totally abolished. And the whole Indian economy was now became part of the global economy. Commodity money relations developed. There was development of commercial agriculture, etc. Now that was the picture one side. On the other hand, there was the extraction of the maximum surplus from the peasants' produce, and that became the basis of early system of colonial plunder. And the mode of appropriation was purely feudal, no doubt about it. The Indian economy, the Indian agriculture was converted into a raw material supplying appendage to metropolitan Britain, and it was also converted into a market for the manufactures of Great Britain. In fact, three important land revenue settlements were introduced in India in three different regions. The first, obviously, is a permanent settlement, which was introduced in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Then we have the Rayatwari settlement in southern India, Bombay and Madras presidencies, and then we have the Mahalwari settlement in the north or the northwest parts of central India. Now we begin with the first one, that is a permanent settlement. The permanent settlement of 1793 was one of the first concrete steps taken by the British to consolidate their grip, their rule over India. In fact, after the Plassey plunder, the foreign ruling classes took a long-term objective in view. They sought to find out ways and means to make their rule in a foreign territory as lasting as ever. But the problem before them was that they were inexperienced. They did not know about the situation, exact situation in the country, in the new territory. And there was also lack of enough personnel. And there was also, of course, no local knowledge. And so what they would have to do was to manipulate the native Indian society in order to meet their commercial requirements. They must do something so that people, at least sections of the people, could be mobilized in their favor, so as to consolidate their own rule on the Indian territory. Of course, they found the Zamindars in Bengal already entrenched in the society, and they were ready to answer to their call. In fact, there were two important motivations behind the introduction of the permanent settlement. One, of course, was the security of revenue, and the other was a politically reliable landed elite, a social stability, there should be some social class, landed class, which would act as the pillars of colonial, as an important pillar of colonial rule. And in fact, these were the two important purposes, two motivations that stood behind the introduction of the permanent settlement. And the colonial rulers felt that if these were done, this could be achieved, then they would be able to establish the permanence of their own dominion on the Indian territory. The permanent settlement, as we have pointed out, was introduced in eastern India, Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. And in fact, the Zamindari settlement in Bengal was more or less inevitable. The only problem before the rulers was how much, to what extent should the Zamindars be pressurized, and what should be the amount of revenue, extent of the pressure, and the amount of the land revenue. These they would have to find out. And to do that, the estates should be searched. They should make a survey, several surveys of different estates. They also, in fact, the British government carried on several experiments over the last 20 years or more. And there were settlements of different types, annual, quinquennial, decennial settlements before the introduction of the permanent settlement. And then there was a commission formed in 1788 known as the Amini Commission, whose main purpose was to build up for the British their own storehouse of information regarding land settlements and agriculture in India. Although the permanent settlement was introduced during the time of Lord Cornwallis, it was not his brainchild. It has been pointed out by Farminger that two persons, Alexander Dow and Henry Patullo, they had anticipated Philip Francis in formulating the ideas on the introduction of the permanent settlement. Dow was very much critical of the assumption of diwani by the company in 1765, and he pointed out that this assumption of the diwani by the company, it brought havoc to the country. It ruined the country. He wanted that the right to landed property should be established, and that all lands should be sold and then settled on a permanent basis. That was his idea. Right to private property, and there should be some permanent arrangement of things in the countryside. There should be no temporary arrangements, but something very much permanent. Patullo was more or less in agreement with Dow's view on the causes of the decline of Bengal agriculture, and he also prescribed more or less the same remedy. At the same time, he also felt that if there is security of property, right to property, meaning security of property, then that would stimulate prosperous Indians to promote investment in land. So there would be some improving landlord. That was a concept which developed during that period. Concept of improving landlord, that if landlords were given private proprietorship over land, then they would be interested in making more and more investments and in initiating improvements in the rural areas. And in fact, this expectation was fulfilled more or less after 1793, that is after the introduction of the permanent settlement. Now, so Dow and Patullo, they were the two earliest advocates of the permanent settlement, and both of them regarded the famine of 1770 as a conclusive evidence of the worthlessness of the existing economic policies. And they advocated in its place a stable, more comprehensive land settlement. You know that Warren Hastings before him, Warren Hastings in the earlier period introduced a farming system. And by farming system, landed estates were auctioned out to the highest bidders. That is, those people received land which ensured that they would give back the maximum amount of return to the colonial government. These are auctioned to the highest bidders on leases for 5 years. But as there was no permanence, so the farmers, these revenue farmers, they took no abiding interest in land, because they knew that their control over land would be only for a period of 5 years and not more than that. And that proved to be disastrous also. The actual collection made by the Zamindars and other speculators varied from year to year and never came up to official expectations. Officials were always eager to extract more and more, but since it was temporary, only for 5 years or for a limited period of time, so the people in charge were not interested, and so it proved to be disastrous both ways, for the peasants as also for the colonial state also, because they were expecting more returns than they actually had been getting by that time. And so the officials started to feel that a sound administration must have security of ownership as its basis, security of ownership over land, proprietorship over land. And nothing but a permanent settlement could ensure this. So it was only through these experiences that many of them came to realize that there should be some permanent order of things rather than any temporary order of things, as was the case in the previous period. We have another important person who actually was associated directly with the permanent settlement. He was Philip Francis. Philip Francis was critical of the farming system, which destroyed the Zamindari medium of political power and thereby removed all incentive to improvement. Instead, he proposed in 1775 a modified form of the permanent settlement, which was based on a balance between the interests of the Zamindars and the interests of the colonial state. So a balance should be made between the two, because everyone realized that the colonial state would have to base its policy on the backing, on the support, active support of the Zamindars. And in fact, Francis claimed that the permanent settlement was a plan proposed by him in 1776 and adopted and executed by the Governor General, Lord Cornwallis, in 1793. It is worth pointing out that the security of revenue was not the sole motivation behind the permanent settlements. This point has been debated also by Ranajit Guha in his book, A Rule of Property for Bengal, and in fact there were other ideas also apart from these two. One was the English notion of the creation of private property in land and improving landlords. We have referred to improving landlords earlier. And there was a French physiocratic idea of capital formation and agricultural development, etc., all of which were all stood behind the introduction of the permanent settlement. So there was a diversity of opinion behind the introduction of the permanent settlement, and before its actual introduction, there were a series of experiments all of which proved to be a failure from the point of view of the colonial state. So the colonial state did not want to fail now also, at that time also, say they wanted to succeed, and all of them felt ultimately that there should be some permanent order of things. But Cornwallis also made it clear in his minutes that improvement was a key word in his argument. Improvement, he emphasized the word improvement. And so from improvement we have the concept of improving landlords. The improving landlord would bring the wasteland under cultivation. He would improve his tenure by better system of embankment, drainage facility. He was expected to encourage also scientific farming, and all these would be done in the long-term interest of the colonial rulers. That was very clear from his minutes. And to add to this, Cornwallis also had a political motivation in his mind, and he expected the new policy to contribute to social stability. And establishing social stability actually meant that there should be some social pillar in favor of colonial rule. A new landed class should be created, which would act as one of the main pillars of colonial rule. We may note here in passing that with the same aim in view, they introduced English education. That is, an English-educated middle class which should act as one of the main pillars of colonial rule. Then we have the bourgeoisie, industrial bourgeoisie, the comprador bourgeoisie, with the same purpose in view, that is so that they would act as one of the pillars of colonial rule. Now, what is true in the case of education, in the case of industry, is also true in the case of agriculture. Of course, agriculture came first. That was one of the first steps that they introduced. Others came later, no doubt about it. Now, here we should also point out that Shore held grave doubts about whether the Zamindars were at all capable of playing the role assigned to them by Cornwallis. The Regulation 1 of 1793 and many other regulations that followed were known collectively as the Cornwallis Code, and it laid down the principal conditions to be fulfilled by the beneficiaries of the permanent settlement, that is, new Zamindars. And it had two special features. The first, now Zamindars and the revenue collectors now became the landlords. They were converted into landlords, into Zamindars. And they were to act not only as the agents of the government in collecting land revenue from the peasants, but they also became the owners, legal owners of land in their Zamindari areas. And their right to ownership was hereditary and transferable. But there was a condition, and that is they would have to pay the revenue on time. And if they failed to pay the revenue on time, then by virtue of the application of the Sunset Law, that would be given, that would be transferred. So it is both hereditary and transferable. Hereditary, it is a conditional. So this ownership of a land was conditional upon his payment of land revenue to the state on time, within the date, within the stipulated date, failing which it would be transferred. So in this sense, it was both hereditary and transferable. And on the other hand, the cultivators were reduced to the low status of mere tenants and were deprived of their long-standing rights to use the pasture and forest lands, irrigation canals, protection against enhancement of rent, etc. All these rights were effaced, were taken away by this as also by other regulations that followed. And the second special feature was that the Zamindars were to give 10/11 parts of the rental they derived from the peasantry to the state, and they retained the remaining portion, that is 1/11 portion, for themselves. So whole has to be divided into 11 parts, 10 to go to the state and 1 to go to the Zamindar. And in case the rental of a Zamindar's estate increased due to extension of cultivation or his capacity to extract more from the tenants, then he would keep the entire increased amount. At the same time, again, he would have to pay the revenue on time, failing which he would have to part with the land, that land would be taken away. Coming to the impact side, other consequences, one can point out that there was just a ruin of the old Zamindars and the rise of new Zamindars, new landlordism. And The dominant feature during the first 2 decades after 1793 was the ruin of the old Zamindars, the chief being the men formerly associated with trade and commerce, officials in the various government departments, dependents of Zamindars, and the lesser Zamindars themselves. And the more old Zamindars were mostly replaced by the Calcutta Banians. Calcutta Banians like the Tagore family, Narkanath Tagore family, Krishnakanta Nondi, Ganga Govinda Sinha. These were the Calcutta Banians who accumulated fortune. As a result, new Rammohn Roy, of course, beneficiary, Narkanath Tagore, Rammohn Roy, they were the beneficiaries of the permanent settlements. In Rajshahi, Nodia, Dinajpur, the old estates fell victim to the exactitude of the new sale law, and the people who became new landowners were the former dependents of Zamindars in these areas, in these districts. So what we see is that after the permanent settlement, new landlords were interested in buying more and more land, and so there is an element of truth in the belief that the permanent settlement made the Bengalis seek fortunes in land rather than in industry. There is a view that this is the reason why Bengali people did not invest in industries. They were always interested in land. One scholar, Sirajul Islam, however, points out that the permanent settlement failed to give birth to an improving landlord. There was no such thing as improving landlord, and it threw the governments into a serious financial confusion. There is one important dispute among scholars whether the beneficiaries of the permanent settlement were urban elements or rural elements. One group of scholars, represented primarily by Chittobroto Pali, Sirajul Islam, Ratnolekha Rai, they hold that those who profited were not necessarily urban elements, but rural elements like the Jamindars Gomastas, Jamindars Amlas, and other dependents. This is one view. On the other hand, we have Binay Bhushan Chaudhuri, who argues that, and he is referring to Dhaka, he is referring to Nodia, that urban elements were also there. And there were many absentee landlords. That is the Babus of Calcutta, who hardly had any attachment to the land and who had always been busy in the cities as Babus with all the necessary vices attached to the Babu culture. Now, apart from these, there was also a hierarchy of sub-infeudatories, sometimes as many as 50, between the Jamindar at the top and the primary producers, that is the peasants at the bottom.
Sir, you stated that more people were investing in land. Therefore, is it true that there was no investment in industries by the Bengalis in that period?
This is partially true. If we consider the situation in the Bengal economy from the late 19th century, if we take into account the Swadeshi period, in the Swadeshi period, Bengal was a center, no doubt about it, because it started from Bengal, the partition, anti-partition campaign, before that also. So during that point of time, a large number of modern industries developed under Bengali ownership. There was a revival of handicraft industries, and not only industries but also in banking, insurance companies, steam navigation, etc. So there are more and more, many investments. We have many important names: Bengal Chemical, Bengal Immunity, Hindustan Cooperative Insurance Society Limited. We have the Dak Bank. We have the Bangolokhi Cotton Mill. We have the Sadhana Oshudhalaya, Shakti Oshudhalaya, various, and many other industries. So Bengalis did invest in industries. They did not. They belong to the small and the medium section of the Indian bourgeoisie. That is true, but that they did invest in industries is also attested by all these things. And side by side, the landowners also, they also made investments in industries. Not just people, middle class people, artisans were there, but landowners were also there, who invested in industries. So that is not true. So industries were there, and of course under Bengali ownership.
Sir, my question is that these landed elite or the zamindars were often called absentee landlords. Why were they called so?
There was a difference between the old zamindars and the new zamindars. Old zamindars lived in the villages. Sometimes they belong to the same caste or subcaste as the village people. And during times of need, they also helped the villages. People say that there were some good zamindars who were treated as fathers, like fathers. Anyway, they were also feudal exploiters. But there was an attachment. And so they also helped them during their times of need. But when it comes to the new zamindars were absentee landlords in a sense till they were living in the towns, in the cities, like Calcutta. They formed part of the Babu culture. And their only ties with the land were only when it came to the collection of rent or revenue and nothing else. So there was hardly any attachment. Of course, they spent a lot of money in the cities, exploited the peasantry in various forms. So absentee landlords were those landlords who made themselves absent from the land which gave them the main sustenance. And that is true because it coincided with the development of the cities also. It is very much tied up with the process of colonization, development of cities. We have Calcutta developed after the coming of the British. There were migrations, particularly Marwari migrations from different parts of Rajasthan. 3 waves of Marwari migrations. They went to many areas. They also went to came to Eastern India. And Calcutta was the center, one of the main centers. So we have the development of Babu culture, and of course there was a settlement, beneficiaries of the settlement. They were living in the towns, in cities like Calcutta. So they absented themselves from their countryside, which was their main route, because they drew money from that source, mainly from that source. Were introduced in India in 3 different regions. The first, obviously, is a permanent settlement, which was introduced in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Then we have the Rayatwari settlement in southern India, Bombay and Madras presidencies, and then we have the Mahalwari settlement in the north or the northwest parts of central India. Now we begin with the first one, that is a permanent settlement. The Permanent Settlement of 1793 was one of the first concrete steps taken by the British to consolidate their grip, their rule over India. In fact, after the Plassey plunder, the foreign ruling classes took a long-term objective in view, and the whole Indian economy now became part of the global economy. Commodity money relations developed. There was development of commercial agriculture, etc. Now that was the picture one side. On the other hand, there was the extraction of the maximum surplus from the peasants' produce, and that became the basis of early system of colonial plunder. and the mode of appropriation was purely feudal, no doubt about it. The Indian economy, the Indian agriculture was converted into a raw material supplying appendage to metropolitan Britain, and it was also converted into a market for the manufactures of Great Britain. In fact, three important land revenue settlements they sought to find out ways and means to make their rule in a foreign territory as lasting as ever. But the problem before them was that they were inexperienced. They did not know about the situation, exact situation in the country, in the new territory. And there was also lack of enough personnel. And there was also, of course, no local knowledge. And so what they would have to do was to manipulate the native Indian society in order to meet their commercial requirements. They must do something so that people, at least sections of the people, could be mobilized in their favor so as to consolidate their own rule on the Today we'll be dealing with the land revenue settlements in British India. It should be pointed out at the outset that the establishment of colonial rule by the British bourgeoisie brought about far-reaching changes in Indian society. And one of those was obviously the change in the agrarian structure. The pre-colonial Indian society was a feudal society, and in its place was established was set up a semi-feudal and semi-colonial structure, and the old feudal structure was mostly dismantled. Land now became a commodity, alienable private property, and peasants' traditional right of occupancy to land was totally abolished.